This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 548th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Character Arcs, Part 15, Introduction to the 6 Flat Archetypes. In studying character arcs, writers easily recognize positive change arcs and negative change arcs. But somewhat more baffling can be the stories that appear to feature neither. These are stories in which the protagonist does not change or seems to have no character arc at all. How do these stories fit into the discussion of archetypal character arcs? If you've studied foundational character arc theory in practice with me before, you know there are two possible answers to the seeming conundrum of the character with no arc. One is simply that he or she doesn't arc. Both the protagonist, the supporting cast, and the story world itself remain relatively unchanged from beginning to end despite everyone's adventures. Indeed, the very point of their adventures might be to maintain a desirable status quo, such as in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The other possibility is that the unchanging protagonist is in fact spearheading what I call a flat arc. As the name suggests, this is an arc in which the protagonist, the story's central actor, remains thematically unchanged, but uses his or her understanding of the story's central thematic truth to catalyze change arcs in the supporting characters. Flat arc protagonists are usually positive influences or impact characters, but if their fixation is on the thematic lie rather than the truth, they can also be instrumental in catalyzing negative change arcs for the supporting characters. Now, over the last few months, we have explored 6 successive life arcs represented by the positive change arcs of 6 primary archetypes: the maiden, the hero, the queen, the king, the crone, and the mage. Each of these positive archetypes represents a rising above the limitations of the previous archetype in the cycle. They also inherently represent a struggle with 12 related shadow or negative archetypes: the damsel and vixen, the coward and bully, the snow queen and sorceress, the puppet and tyrant, the hermit and witch, and the miser and sorcerer. As unchanging characters, flat arc protagonists are equally archetypal, but unlike these 6 positive change arcs, they do not demonstrate a journey from one archetype to another, for example, maiden to hero. Rather, they represent the interstitial period of a character's life, in which the character may be seen to be resting in between personal transformations. As such, these flat archetypes are often seen to be helping or teaching other characters some of the same lessons they just learned in their own previously completed arcs. So the 6 flat or resting archetypes can be seen like this. Number 1, the child, which precedes the maiden arc. Number 2, the lover, which precedes the hero arc. Number 3, the parent, which precedes the queen arc. Number 4, the ruler, which precedes the king arc. Number 5, the elder, which precedes the crone arc. And number 6, the mentor, which precedes the mage arc. As you can see, many of these flat archetypes initially seem synonymous with the change arcs that follow. For example, ruler and king, and elder and crone. In many ways, they are synonymous, in large part because each of the positive change archetypes begins its first act within the complacency of the preceding flat archetype. For example, the king arc begins with the character clearly a ruler, but the story does not leave him as such, since by the end he will be asked to give up his throne in some way. However, a story that is about the flat archetype is one in which the protagonist will begin and end within the same archetype. If he begins as a ruler, he will end as a ruler, still upon his throne in the story's conclusion. Flat arcs are anything but boring. They offer the potential to unapologetically present archetypal characters who do what we all want to do: enact meaningful change on the world around us. Now, depending on whether the protagonist is aligned with the story's thematic truth or lie, that change may be more or less positive or negative. But for the sake of this discussion, since we've already discussed the negative archetypes, we will be assuming that the archetypal protagonists featured in these flat arc stories are positive in their alignment with a beneficial truth. In short, these are characters who are likely to be in between their own positive change arcs. As mentioned, the hallmark of a flat arc, in contrast to a story with no arc, is that the protagonist is able to create significant change in the world around him. He is the impact character in someone else's positive change arc. Particularly within the cycle of the archetypal life arcs that we've been discussing this year, the flat archetypes represent moments within the protagonist's life in which he or she is able to put to use the lessons learned in previous arcs. Therefore, the role of the flat archetypes can be seen within the overall cycle like this. Adolescent awakening demands the child undertake her coming-of-age initiation as the maiden, who then explores a burgeoning into adulthood as the lover. The lover must then embark on the hero's quest, but comes home from his adventures and settles down to become a parent. As her own children begin reaching maturity, the parent must then rise up as queen to defend and properly lead them. Having been crowned, he may spend years as the ruler of the kingdom, before then taking the sacrificial king arc. Now an elder, the character influences subsequent generations on the way to undergoing a full crone arc. And finally, the character may bless the kingdom as one of the most archetypal characters of all, the mentor, before finally entering the final journey of the mage. As always, all of these titles are symbolic. A character does not literally need to be a parent in order to represent the parent archetype, any more than a mage character must literally be able to work magic. We will discuss this further in each subsequent post. So, how do the positive archetypes relate to the flat archetypes? Flat arc stories are, in fact, positive change arc stories in disguise. Although they seem at first glance to be stories in which there is no arc, this is an illusion. The protagonist doesn't change, but at least one supporting character does. As such, you can often overlay any appropriate positive change archetypal journey onto the flat arc character's story, but with a supporting character enacting the actual journey. The flat archetypal protagonist will still be the primary actor within the conflict, which is ultimately how we define which character is the protagonist. But his or her actions and adherence to the thematic truth will allow other characters to move forward in their own life journeys. Depending on the specifics of the story, the change arc supporting character may feature prominently or as more of a subplot. We can see how this works perhaps most obviously in the relationship between the hero and the mentor. The flat mentor archetype is an easily recognizable impact character within the classical hero's journey. But if we flip the script from a hero arc to a mage arc, the mentor becomes the protagonist and the hero becomes a supporting character. Unlike a hero arc, in which the mentor almost always dies to facilitate a sensible reason for the immature hero to be the one to end the conflict, a mage arc often pits the hero and the mage against differing and more age-appropriate antagonists. A perfect example of this can be found in The Lord of the Rings, in which Gandalf, a universally recognized archetypal mentor character, is in fact arguably the story's protagonist. Certainly, he displays agency and centrality to the conflict throughout, but he focuses on the supernatural antagonists that only he can confront, while the heroes, queens, and kings are inspired by his example to fight their own battles and enact their own change arcs. So how do the shadow archetypes relate to the flat archetypes? None of the flat archetypes we will be discussing are naturally negative, although the already discussed shadow archetypes are often in themselves relatively static. The passive negative archetypes in particular tend to remain stuck in their own fear and complacency. And these characters can be used as protagonists or antagonists within negative flat arcs in which the protagonist changes supporting characters for the worse. However, in regards to the flat archetypes we will be discussing over the next month and a half, the shadow archetypes are more likely to show up either as antagonists or as the supporting characters who will be inspired to undertake a positive journey by the end of the story. Usually, any negative archetypes within a flat arc story will be those from arcs that preceded the protagonists. For example, if the protagonist is a parent, which is the flat or resting form of the queen, then she is most likely to interact with the negative archetypes of damsel and vixen, coward and bully, or snow queen and sorceress. And this is because these younger archetypes are the only ones she is equipped to help or defeat at this stage of her own growth. Should she be challenged by a later negative archetype, such as the puppet or tyrant, she would need to advance out of the parent archetype and change into a full-blown queen arc. A flat arc story will be about a character who understands something important that the rest of the story world does not. It is a story about this character using this understanding to advance and benefit the current story world. Flat arc stories are not mythic journeys in the same way as the 6 foundational life arc archetypes. Although they will often feature glimpses of supporting characters taking these journeys, the flat arcs themselves are more varied and episodic than the 6 positive change character arcs. There are many types of stories that can be told about a child, or a ruler, or an elder. Indeed, many people spend years, decades even, within the same flat archetype before life confronts them with new challenges that demand they journey on into the subsequent life arc. As such, I won't be offering a mythic beat sheet for the flat archetypes in the same way I did for the positive archetypes. The only consistent beat sheet for the flat arcs is that of the flat arc character arc structure itself, which I talk about elsewhere on my website and in my book, Creating Character Arcs. Over the course of the next 6 episodes, which is the final section in this very long series, we will be diving into the foundational aspects of these interstitial flat archetypes and looking at how you can recreate these important archetypes within your own stories. So stay tuned. Next week, we will study the flat archetype of the child. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Are you more drawn to writing flat or change arcs? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors, and it's many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/KMWyland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.